Hi there, my name is Ron Rogers, and this presentation is titled XB-70 Midair. For the first 16 seconds after impact, things seemed to be stable, and then it went very badly. I had a chance to talk to the chief test pilot, Al White, at a Society of Experimental Test Pilots symposium, good 35 years plus after the accident, and we had quite an extensive conversation. And one thing that I found of interest was even that long of a period after the accident, it was still very emotional for him to discuss the accident. And one of the interesting aspects of the accident was midair was called out on the radio by one of the chase pilots. And at first, Al didn't know who had the midair because he didn't feel anything right away, and the aircraft continued to fly stably, like I said, for 16 seconds before it started to go out of control. So at first, he didn't know who it was that had even had the midair. Now, the XB-70 to me is an absolutely beautiful aircraft, but it was an aircraft that was obsolete even before its time. It was designed in the late 50s to be a replacement for the B-52 bomber. Now, any aircraft that comes along and is geared to be a replacement of the B-52 bomber, as we all know, has not had a very good history. This was supposed to take the capabilities of the B-52, the bomb load capability, and combine it with the speed of the B-58, which at the time was Mach 2. So they ended up with an aircraft that was planned to be a 70,000-foot ceiling Mach 3 aircraft, and of course it did achieve this Mach 3 plus, and it achieved 3.01. The first flight of this aircraft was in 21 September 1964, and it was retired in 4 February 1969. NASA got a chance to fly it for research. The aircraft basically became a research aircraft because it was essentially canceled before it was begun, but they wanted to see what kind of data they could get because they needed a lot of data in this area of flight, which they did not have. For large type of aircraft, they had X-15 data that was coming in. The program was close to being completed, and they needed to gain data on larger aircraft. So it essentially became a research vehicle. It was canceled by the Air Force. They tried to preserve it, but it ended up being canceled in 1961. And they decided just to go ahead, redesign it. Instead of a crew of 4, it would have a crew of 2, a pilot and a co-pilot, and it would be a research vehicle designated the XB-70A, and 2 of these aircraft were built. Now, the XB-70s were intended to be used for the advanced study of aerodynamics, propulsion, and other subjects related to large supersonic transports. The XB-70 uses a concept known as compression lift, which results from a shock wave generated by the leading edge of the engine inlet splitter below the apex of the wing. And at Mach 3 cruising speeds, the shock wave is bent back about 65 degrees, and the wing is superimposed on the shock, which has a pressure of 40 pounds per square foot under the aircraft, and it has this pressure, which is higher, more in front of the shock than behind it. Compression lift is provided 5% of the total lift of the aircraft. Now, Al told me that just about every flight and the first few flights of the Valkyrie ended in an emergency of one sort or another. The maiden flight occurred on 21 September 1964, and shortly after he took off out of Palmdale, which is the contractor area down there near Edwards, and doing the short hop over to Edwards Air Force Base to deliver it there for the flight testing. So in that short hop, shortly after takeoff, he lost an engine, had to shut down one of the 6, and then had a gear malfunction warning. So he had to leave the gear down, which limited the speed on the first flight. And on touchdown, he, as you can see from the picture, he had a problem with the with both main gear there, and resulted in of course, an emergency landing stop on the runway and stuff like that. They weren't able to go supersonic until the third flight of the aircraft. Now, the first aircraft was tail number 20201, and the second one was 20207. And this is the second one being delivered to Edwards Air Force Base. And anybody familiar with Edwards Air Force Base can see that ramp is pretty sparse compared to what it is when I was there back in the late 70s even, and I'm sure today it's even more congested with lots of buildings. Now, they learned a lot from the test flights of the XB-70, and a lot of the, of course, interesting data they acquired had to do with the thermodynamics of high-speed flight. And just for the interest, during a Mach 3 cruise, the aircraft would reach an average temperature of 450 degrees Fahrenheit. The leading edges would reach 630 degrees Fahrenheit, and the engine compartments up to 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, the aircraft provided a lot of useful data that was used later in the development of the B-1 bomber and the supersonic transport. Of course, that program for the U.S. was canceled. And via espionage, it also contributed to the Tupolev Tu-144 program. And also, of course, the Blackbird SR-71 program. Now, a photo mission was planned on June 8th, 1966, and it was using the XB-70A number 2. You can see the 207 on the tail number. The first XB-70, of course, is in Wright-Patterson Museum, and I'll talk about that in a minute. And the idea was to get some publicity footage, and it was basically a bunch of aircraft that all used GE engines. And the blue arrow points to Joe Walker's F-104. And supposedly what happened, and when I was a chase pilot out at Edwards, of course, this type of situation and danger of being next to a large aircraft, and I flew chase next to a lot of large aircraft such as B-52s, C-5s, and things of the sort. And part of the issue was, well, where can you safely be? And this was at a time where wake vortices were typically not well understood. And what they think happened was that Joe Walker got forward of the wing area and was sighting off the fuselage. Now, this is all speculation because Joe unfortunately died in the crash. But they think he was forward, and the wings are quite extensive, and they think he might have inadvertently got a little too close when he slipped back to the vortice, and it looped him up over the top, and his aircraft swept across the rudders there of the XB-70 and took almost all of the right one off and a good percentage of the left one off. Now, this was unfortunately the first and last flight in the aircraft for a Major Carl Cross, who was the co-pilot on the aircraft. This was a very easy-going test flight, supposedly, because it's not uncommon to do some test flight type of activities and then get some photo shoots at the end. I've done several of those type of flights. And so this was a fairly easy, benign, routine test flight that was going to give Carl Cross an introduction into the XB-70 as part of his checkout. And like I mentioned, the call of midair at first did not get L's attention because he wasn't sure who it referred to. But Joe Cotton, as the T-38 chase, referred to the two verticals that came off left and right. And L knew that he was the only aircraft in the formation that had two verticals. Nobody directly said that there had been a midair with the XB-70, but when they said two verticals came off, at that point, he knew it was his aircraft that had been hit. But initially, the aircraft was flying straight, so it was kind of like, well, maybe we can keep this thing under control. But unfortunately, that only lasted for approximately 16 seconds. Now, as I mentioned, the aircraft continued to fly normally for 16 seconds before it started a slight roll. And L tried to counteract it, but without rudders, it wasn't effective. And that the fire you see in the bottom right of the picture, that is Joe Walker's F-104, the midsection. The aircraft was cut in several pieces right behind the cockpit, and Joe was found in the crash, still in the seat, apparently killed on impact. Now, the aircraft started the roll, and Al couldn't counteract it, and it very suddenly rolled over into inverted, uncontrollable right-hand spiral. Part of the left wing broke off and started spewing out fuel. Now, Al called for bailout, and part of the process in bailing out is you pull a lever and you are encapsulated. The ejection seat is encapsulated because this was supposed to be part of the system that would allow you to bail out at very high speeds. Unfortunately, as this occurred, Al's arm was severely trapped in the capsule mechanism as it closed, and he fought for a good 80 seconds before he's able to free his arm, because the way his elbow was stuck out, and he was severely injured in this, the way his elbow was stuck out, if he would have punched out, it would have cut his elbow off because of the clearance between the capsule and the structure on the XB-70 as he would have exited the aircraft. So this went on for 80 seconds in the spin, and there's quite a moment arm on the capsule there when you're in the front of it in the cockpit from the center of gravity as this thing is spinning. Now, Carl Cross was never able to successfully eject from the XB-70, and his body was found in the wreckage after it impacted the desert. L figures that since he was rather of shorter stature and his arms were shorter, that he was able to pull his arms in to activate the ejection seat, where Carl may not have been, being a slightly taller individual. And he thinks that aspect may have saved his life because the forces of the spinning aircraft were quite high. And as he was telling me the part where he had to leave the aircraft and there was nothing he can do for Carl, that was an emotional moment for him. And I mean, all these years afterwards, he still couldn't tell that without it having quite an impact on him, as you can, I'm sure, imagine. Now, here's a picture of Al White, of course, and since he put his name on the picture there, and the seat and the capsule mechanism is on the right side. Now, that's a little hard to see, but the seat actually is, if you eject and you pull the encapsulation lever, it is pulled back, retracted into the capsule, and then the clam doors fall down. It's sort of like what was done in the B-58. That also had an encapsulation system. The interesting thing on the B-58 is once you were encapsulated, you still could operate the stick, so you could still fly the airplane, and you had 4 switches, it had 4 engines, that you could reduce power only. You couldn't advance it, but you could reduce power. So if the aircraft was in trouble, you could encapsulate yourself, still fly it, and slow down, hopefully getting the aircraft under control. Well, in November of 1966, the remaining XB-70 01 was retired from the Air Force use and was given to NASA essentially, and there was a joint NASA-USAF test program that operated from 1966 until January of 1967, and they did a lot of they got a lot of performance data, and some of the interesting things were the longest flight was 3 hours and 40 minutes. That was on 6 January of 1966. The fastest speed was 2,020 miles per hour. That translates to a Mach number, the highest Mach number of 3.08. Highest altitude reached was 74,000 feet, and the longest sustained Mach 3 flight was 32 minutes, and the total time at Mach 3 was 108 minutes. That comprised of 10 flights. And after the test program, and you notice on the wingtip there, I like this picture because it shows that the wingtips, the outer panel sections, could be tilted down from about 25 to 65 degrees, if I remember correctly, during test flight. That actually increased the compression lift and added to a little bit of lateral stability, because at high speed, the CN beta, the lateral stability, becomes an extremely important factor. If you don't have good lateral stability at high speed, because that function, it gets reduced at high speed, and if you don't have good lateral stability at high speed, your supersonic aircraft can end up going sideways. And of course, you're probably familiar with the unstarts on the SR-71. You get an unstart on one engine and you do an unstart on the other engine, which is quite impressive, I am told. But if you don't do that, you end up going sideways, and where that system failed, the aircraft, the SR-71, did end up going sideways and was destroyed. Now here is the last flight of the XB-70. It was delivered to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, and the blue arrow points to the elevons, flaparounds, the 6 surfaces back there that acted both as flaps and ailerons as such. And this is a picture I took of the XB-70 at the Air Force Museum, actually back when I was in the Air Force. They had this and a number of very historic aircraft. And the interesting thing about the Wright-Patterson Museum is you don't get there just by being a certain model of a important aircraft. That aircraft in itself is historic. And of course, there were only 2 XB-70s, so the one remaining one is going to be historic. But all the other aircraft there, if you read the little information, it's very interesting that these aircraft have a lot of good history. Now, here is the XB-70. They moved it and a lot of very important vehicles inside, because you really need to protect these. And there's a local contingency of Society of Experimental Test Pilot people that get to come into Wright-Patterson, and I got to do this one time. You come in after dark, after the museum's closed, not necessarily after dark, but after the museum's closed, and they have it set up where we get to go inside the aircraft, and this is very interesting. But one of the interesting things I must point out is these are test vehicles, and there's not a whole lot of instrumentation in them often of any great significance. And this is just an absolutely beautiful aircraft. And the 6 engines there, these things had a special fuel, JP6, that was formulated for the environmental conditions that this aircraft would experience, and also to be a high-density fuel. There's the cockpit of the XB-70 with those nice engine displays for 6 engines, and also a regular type of yoke control. And there are those 6 throttles and 6 engines. So that's the story of the XB-70, and unfortunately the demise of the second test aircraft in an unfortunate accident. And I hope you enjoyed the presentation. I know this one was a little bit long. Sorry about that, but there's a lot of material to cover, and this is just a cool aircraft, and I left a lot out, as you probably know. But it's just an amazing aircraft, and I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for watching.